A poor girl saves a man at the foot of the mountain. Unaware he's a billionaire changes her life. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. Snowflakes swirled like tiny daggers in the air, cutting into Emily Dawson's exposed cheeks as she trudged through the thick snow, her boots sinking deep with every step. The sky above was a heavy gray, the kind that warned of an impending blizzard. She pulled her tattered coat tighter around her, cursing the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Emily had ventured further from her cabin than usual, desperate to gather enough firewood before nightfall. The forest at the base of the mountain was eerily silent, except for the occasional groan of the wind pushing against the towering pines. She adjusted the axe slung across her back, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. Then she heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the wind, a low, guttural moan. She stopped in her tracks, her pulse quickening. At first she thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, a weak, pain-laced groan. Her eyes darted around, scanning the snowy expanse. The sound was close, but with the wind screaming through the trees, it was impossible to pinpoint its exact direction. "Hello?" she called out, her voice uncertain. No answer. Emily hesitated for only a moment before pushing forward, her instincts screaming that something or someone was in trouble. She moved cautiously, her boots crunching against the ice-crusted snow. Then, through the thick white blanket covering the ground, she spotted something unusual, a dark shape, barely visible beneath a mound of snow. Her heart leaped into her throat. She rushed forward, falling to her knees beside the figure. Brushing away the fresh snow, her breath caught when she saw the man's face, pale, his dark hair frozen at the edges. His clothes, though of expensive material, were torn and soaked through. His lips were nearly blue, his eyes half closed. "Hey, can you hear me?" Emily shook his shoulder, but he barely reacted. "Sir, wake up." A weak groan escaped his lips. His fingers twitched slightly, as if fighting against the cold's deadly grip. Emily leaned in closer. "You need to wake up. If you stay out here, you'll die." His lips parted, and for a moment she thought he would speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. "Help!" Emily clenched her jaw, quickly assessing the situation. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, blood staining the snow beneath him. A broken leg in this weather, he wouldn't last much longer. Cursing under her breath, she grabbed his arm and tried to pull him up. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight against the snow. "Come on," she gritted her teeth, shifting his arm over her shoulder. "I'm not leaving you here." With all the strength she could muster, she heaved him up, staggering under his weight. Every step was a battle against the deep snow and the icy wind cutting through her coat. The man groaned in pain as she dragged him forward, his head lolling against her shoulder. She didn't know who he was or how he had ended up here, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting him home before the cold claimed him forever. Emily stumbled through the thick snow, her arms wrapped tightly around the unconscious man as she dragged him toward her cabin. The cold was relentless, slicing through her coat and numbing her limbs, but she refused to stop. The man's breath was shallow, his body slack against hers. She couldn't let him die. By the time she reached the cabin, her muscles burned with exhaustion. She kicked the door open, nearly collapsing as she pulled him inside. The warmth of the cabin was a stark contrast to the icy wilderness outside. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. With great effort, she maneuvered him onto the old couch near the fireplace. His body was ice cold, his fingers stiff with frostbite. She quickly grabbed a pile of blankets, wrapping them around him before kneeling beside him to examine his injuries. His face was gaunt, his features sharp even in unconsciousness. His expensive coat was torn, the fabric stiff with frozen blood. Her eyes landed on his leg. A deep gash ran along his shin, the wound looking angry and raw against his pale skin. Emily cursed under her breath. If it got infected, he wouldn't survive. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the urgency. She cleaned the wound with warm water, wincing at the sight of the deep cut. He stirred slightly, a faint groan escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. After wrapping his leg tightly with fresh bandages, she let out a slow breath. Now, all she could do was wait. Hours passed. Emily sat in the old wooden chair across from the couch, watching the man with wary eyes. His breathing had grown steadier, his face no longer ghostly pale. The firelight cast soft shadows over his features, highlighting the rough stubble on his jaw, the strong lines of his face. He didn't look like a local. Who was he? And what the hell had he been doing in the middle of nowhere? Just as her mind swirled with questions, a hoarse voice broke the silence. "Where am I?" Emily shot up, moving closer. The man's eyelids fluttered open, revealing stormy gray eyes that darted around the room in confusion. "You're in my cabin?" she said, keeping her voice firm but calm. "I found you half dead in the snow." He groaned, his hand moving to his temple, as if trying to piece together his thoughts. I don't remember." Emily narrowed her eyes. "What's your name?" He hesitated, blinking against the firelight. Then, after a long pause, he rasped, "Richard. Richard Caldwell." Something about the name stirred a distant familiarity in her, but she couldn't quite place it. "You were in bad shape when I found you," she said, crossing her arms. "Your leg was messed up, and you had no supplies, no proper gear. What happened to you?" Richard exhaled sharply, struggling to sit up. Pain flashed across his face, and he clutched his bandaged leg. I don't know. I remember the cold. The storm." Then he shook his head, frustration darkening his features. "Everything else is a blur." Emily studied him carefully. She wasn't sure if he was lying or genuinely confused. Either way, something about his situation didn't sit right with her. Then, his expression suddenly shifted from confusion to alarm. "My phone," he muttered, patting the pockets of his torn coat. "My wallet. Where the hell?" Emily's stomach tightened. "They weren't on you when I found you." Richard's jaw clenched. No, I had them. I remember I had my phone, my wallet, my watch. They're gone." A heavy silence settled between them. Emily had seen enough in her life to know what this meant. Someone had taken his things, and in a place as unforgiving as the Alaskan wilderness, that didn't happen by accident. "You think someone robbed you?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Seems like the only explanation, doesn't it?" Emily frowned. If someone had left him out there to die, that meant whoever did this had wanted him gone. But why? She glanced at the fire, the flames flickering as if mirroring her thoughts. Richard Caldwell. A man with expensive clothes, a sharp look in his eyes, and no memory of how he ended up half frozen on the mountain. Something about him didn't add up. And yet, despite the unease curling in her stomach, she couldn't turn him away. Not yet. The morning light filtered through the frosted window panes, casting a pale glow over the small wooden cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only embers crackling softly in the quiet. Emily moved about the cabin with practiced efficiency, layering more wood into the stove and setting a kettle over the flames. The air smelled of pine and the faint scent of smoked meat, a humble but familiar aroma in this house. Behind her, the sound of rustling blankets made her turn. Richard was stirring, his movements slow and stiff, wincing as he adjusted his injured leg. His face still bore the pale exhaustion of someone recovering from near death, but his sharp gray eyes flicked toward her, more alert than the night before. "You're awake," she said, setting down the tin cup she had been holding. He gave a small nod, running a hand over his face, as if trying to wipe away the remnants of whatever nightmare had followed him into sleep. "Yeah. Guess I owe you a thank you for not leaving me out there." Emily scoffed, pouring hot water into the tin cup and walking over to him. "You'd be frozen solid if I had." She handed him the cup. "Drink. It'll help warm you up." Richard took it hesitantly, eyeing the steaming liquid. "What is it?" "Pine needle tea." She smirked at his doubtful expression. "You don't have much choice, city boy. It's either that or freeze." At the word city boy, Richard gave her a bemused look but said nothing. He lifted the cup to his lips, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste, but he drank it nonetheless. Just then the door creaked open and an elderly woman stepped inside. Wrapped in thick furs, her sharp blue eyes immediately locked onto Richard with a calculating gaze. "So this is the stranger you dragged in from the snow," she said, her voice lined with both curiosity and skepticism. Emily straightened. "Grandma, this is Richard. Richard, this is Martha Dawson." Richard nodded, attempting to shift himself into a more upright position. "Mom." Martha merely hummed, stepping closer and taking a long look at him before turning back to Emily. "He shouldn't be here." Emily crossed her arms. "I couldn't just leave him to die." Martha sighed, untying her fur-lined hood. "You're too soft-hearted, child. Strangers mean trouble." Emily clenched her jaw but said nothing. She knew Martha wasn't cruel, just cautious. Life in Alaska had made her that way. Still, Emily had made her choice. "He'll stay until he's strong enough to leave," she said firmly. Martha exhaled through her nose, clearly unconvinced, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she walked to the stove and began preparing breakfast, her movements slow but precise. Richard watched in silence as the two women worked, his gaze drifting over the humble cabin. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with jars of preserved food, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. A few old hunting rifles rested near the door, their wooden stocks worn smooth from years of use. Despite its simplicity, the cabin was warm, both in temperature and in the quiet, unspoken bond between grandmother and granddaughter. The smell of food filled the air, and Richard's stomach twisted painfully in response. He hadn't realized just how hungry he was until now. Emily caught the look on his face and smirked. "Haven't eaten in a while, have you?" "Not since," he frowned. "I don't actually remember." "Well, you're in luck. Breakfast is almost ready." A few minutes later, Martha set down 3 wooden bowls on the table. Inside was a thick stew made from what looked like dried venison, root vegetables, and wild herbs. It was nothing fancy, just simple rustic food, but it smelled good. Richard hesitated before picking up the wooden spoon and taking a bite. The stew was hot, rich with the deep, earthy flavors of slow-cooked meat and wild seasonings. It was unlike anything he had ever eaten before, not the refined meals of 5-star restaurants, nor the processed food of city life. It was real, unpretentious, nourishing in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. He glanced at Emily, who ate with the same quiet efficiency seemed to apply to everything. "You live like this every day?" he asked after a moment. Emily looked up. "Like what?" "Hunting for food, making your own medicine, chopping wood just to keep warm." She shrugged. "Yeah, it's not easy, but it's life." Richard shook his head, stirring his stew absent-mindedly. "I don't think I've ever had to work that hard for anything." Martha snorted. "Doesn't surprise me." Richard chuckled under his breath. "I bet." Emily watched him for a moment. There was something strange about seeing a man who clearly came from wealth, sitting at their modest table, eating their simple food. He was out of place here, yet something about the way he was looking at his bowl, as if re-evaluating everything he had ever known, made her wonder. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he seemed. The days passed slowly in the Dawson cabin, marked by the rhythmic crackling of the fire and the muffled howls of the wind outside. Richard's strength was returning, though his injured leg still kept him from moving around too much. Despite the discomfort, he found himself strangely at ease in the quiet simplicity of the place. Emily was always busy, chopping wood, checking traps, preparing food, and tending to her grandmother. She never once complained, never hesitated to get her hands dirty. Richard had never met anyone like her before. One evening, as the fire flickered warmly in the hearth, Richard sat up on the couch, stretching his sore limbs. Emily was at the small wooden table, carefully sewing a tear in her coat. The room smelled of pine and smoke, a scent he was beginning to associate with safety. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, breaking the silence. Emily didn't look up. "You're not secretly a murderer, are you?" Richard let out a small chuckle. "No, but I am rich." That made her glance up, one eyebrow raised. He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "My full name is Richard Caldwell. I own a company called Caldwell Enterprises. We specialize in real estate and private investments. I have offices in New York, London, and Tokyo." Emily blinked. "Okay." Richard waited for more. A reaction. Shock, curiosity, something. But she just shrugged and went back to sewing. "That's it?" he asked, incredulous. She didn't even bother looking at him this time. "What do you want me to say?" "Well, I don't know," Richard said, gesturing vaguely. "Most people would be a little more surprised." Emily tied off the thread and bit it between her teeth before finally meeting his gaze. "It doesn't change anything." Richard stared at her, genuinely baffled. "You're telling me you don't care at all?" She sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Look, Richard, maybe in your world money means everything. But here, it won't light a fire, it won't feed you, and it sure as hell won't save you when you're half dead in a snowstorm." Richard opened his mouth, but she wasn't finished. "Out there, you might be some big-shot millionaire," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the world beyond the cabin walls. "But here, you're just a guy who got lost in the snow." The words hit him harder than he expected. His entire life, people had treated him differently because of his wealth, his employees, his so-called friends, even the women he dated. He was used to a world where money dictated power, where his name alone commanded respect. But Emily didn't give a damn. For the first time in his life, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Humility? He leaned back against the couch, staring at the fire, his thoughts tangled. Emily, unfazed, stood and stretched. "I'm going to bed. Try not to overthink it too much, city boy." Richard watched her disappear into the small adjoining room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been living his entire life wrong. The morning air was crisp and biting, thick with the scent of pine and fresh snow. Richard stepped out of the cabin, leaning against the wooden railing as he took in the endless expanse of wilderness before him. The towering mountains stood against the pale blue sky, their peaks dusted in white, untouched by time. It was a sight unlike anything he had ever seen in New York, a world that belonged not to men in suits, but to the earth itself. Emily emerged from the side of the cabin, an old axe slung over her shoulder. She glanced at him, then at the firewood pile near the door. "If you're going to stand there all day, at least make yourself useful," she said, tossing him a pair of gloves. Richard barely caught them before they hit his chest. "Chopping wood? Really?" Emily smirked. "Unless you'd rather freeze tonight." Richard sighed, pulling on the gloves. He had spent his life making billion-dollar deals, managing entire companies. He had never chopped a single piece of firewood. But as he followed Emily to the clearing behind the cabin, he realized something strange. For the first time, he wanted to try. At first, Richard was terrible. The axe was heavier than he expected, and every time he swung it down, the logs barely split. Emily watched, arms crossed, barely holding back a grin. "You don't have to hit it like it insulted your stock portfolio," she teased. Richard groaned, wiping sweat from his brow. "Maybe you should just do it." "Nope," she said, stepping closer. "Here, adjust your grip. Stand like this." She positioned his hands over the wooden handle, guiding him to shift his stance. Her fingers were calloused but warm, steadying his movements. Richard found himself momentarily distracted by the nearness of her, the way the sunlight caught the strands of her wind-tousled hair. "Now try again," she said. He swallowed hard and focused. This time, when he swung the axe, the log split cleanly in two. Emily grinned. "There you go." Richard stared at the broken pieces, something like satisfaction stirring in his chest. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Maybe there was something to this whole working with your hands thing after all. Days passed, and Richard began to adapt. He helped Emily with small tasks, fetching water from the frozen stream, patching up the old wooden roof of the cabin, even setting simple snares in the forest. His suit and tie had been replaced with thick woolen clothes borrowed from Emily's grandfather's old trunk. His hands, once used only for signing contracts, were now rough from labor. And for some reason, he didn't hate it. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Emily handed him a bow. "You're going to teach me how to hunt now?" Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. Emily smirked. "You want to eat, don't you?" Richard sighed, shaking his head. "Fine. But if I die doing this, you're telling my board of directors it was your fault." Emily just laughed. The next morning, the two of them moved carefully through the woods, the air crisp with the scent of fresh pine. Richard tried to step as lightly as Emily, but she was like a ghost, silent, deliberate. He, on the other hand, snapped every twig in his path. They tracked a rabbit for nearly an hour, and when the moment came, Emily nudged him. "All right, city boy, take your shot." Richard hesitated, gripping the bowstring. The rabbit twitched its ears, sensing danger. "You hesitate, you lose," Emily whispered. Richard exhaled slowly and released the arrow. It missed by a mile. Emily winced. "Okay, that was painful to watch." Richard groaned, rubbing his forehead. "Maybe I should stick to real estate." She laughed. "Come on, we'll try again." Later that afternoon, as they made their way back toward the cabin, something shifted in the air. The birds stopped chirping. The wind stilled. Emily froze. Richard frowned. "What is it?" A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the trees. Richard's blood turned to ice. Slowly he turned his head, just in time to see the massive grizzly bear emerge from the underbrush. Shit. The bear's dark eyes locked onto them, its muscles tensing. It was close, too close. And it was huge. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He had never felt fear like this before. Emily reacted first. Slowly. "Move back," she whispered. Richard did, as she said, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. But the bear huffed, stepping forward, its massive paws crunching the snow. Then, suddenly, it charged. Richard barely had time to react before Emily grabbed his arm and shoved him behind a tree. In one fluid motion, she raised her rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The deafening crack of the bullet shattered the silence. The bear skidded to a stop, its ears flattening. It hesitated for a moment, then let out a final huff before turning and lumbering back into the woods. Richard's hands were shaking as he pressed himself against the tree, struggling to breathe. Emily lowered her gun, exhaling slowly. That, Richard panted, was the single most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. Emily smirked, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. "Welcome to Alaska." Richard let out a breathless laugh, still trying to steady his nerves. But something had changed. Emily had risked her life for him, without hesitation, without thinking twice, and Richard knew, deep down, that no one had ever done that for him before. Not his business partners, not the women he had dated, not even the people he called friends. But Emily, this girl who barely knew him, who had no reason to care, had saved his life. And in that moment, Richard Caldwell, billionaire CEO, realized something for the first time. All the money in the world meant nothing compared to this. The crackling fire was the only sound filling the cabin as Richard sat at the wooden table, staring at his hands. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, rattling the shutters, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, piecing together fragmented memories, trying to make sense of what had happened to him. Emily sat across from him, sipping her tea, watching him with quiet curiosity. "You look like a man who's just figured something out," she finally said. Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I think I know why I was out there, why I nearly died." Emily set her cup down. "Go on." He let out a slow breath, trying to put the pieces together. "Before I woke up in the snow, I was in Alaska for a business meeting. My company, Caldwell Enterprises, was negotiating a deal to acquire a mining operation. A gold mine, to be exact." Emily's brow furrowed. "A gold mine?" Richard nodded. "It's one of the last untouched reserves in the region. Billions of dollars in untapped resources. My company had been negotiating the purchase for months." Emily's expression darkened. "And let me guess, the deal wasn't exactly clean." Richard hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't given much thought to the moral implications of his business deals before. He had people for that. But now, sitting in this cabin, seeing the world through Emily's eyes, things felt different. "The negotiations were intense," he admitted. "Not everyone wanted me to get control of the mine. There were other investors, competitors, people who stood to gain if I disappeared." Emily leaned forward. "You think someone tried to get rid of you?" Richard clenched his jaw. "Not just someone, I think it was my own assistant." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Jonathan Reed, his right-hand man, the person who handled his schedule, his travel, his security, the person he trusted most in his business, and the last person he had seen before waking up in the snow. The memory returned in flashes. The private meeting in a luxury lodge near Fairbanks. Jonathan standing by the fireplace, reviewing final documents. "Everything is set," Jonathan had said, pouring Richard a drink. "By this time tomorrow, the mine will be yours." Richard had taken the glass, nodding. "Good. I don't want any surprises." Jonathan had smiled. "Of course. You can always trust me." Then darkness. A sharp pain in his skull. The bitter taste of something in his drink. And then cold. Ice. The blinding white of the snow. Richard gritted his teeth, his hands curling into fists. He must have drugged me. Left me out there, knowing I wouldn't survive. By the time they declared me missing, the deal would have already been signed, without me. Emily's expression hardened. "So he tried to kill you for money." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "That's the world I come from." Emily shook her head, disgust flashing in her green eyes. "Unbelievable. And to think you actually trusted this guy." Richard exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I did." He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. "I can't let him get away with this." Emily studied him for a long moment. "So, what are you going to do?" Richard looked up, his gray eyes dark with determination. "I have to go back." A silence fell between them. Emily leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Right. Of course. Go back to your world of power and money." Richard frowned. "I don't have a choice. If I don't stop him, he'll take everything I've built. He'll win." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what happens after that?" "You fix your business, put the bad guy in jail, and go back to your fancy penthouse in New York." Richard hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. All he knew was that he couldn't let this betrayal stand. But now, looking at Emily, at this life he had come to respect in ways he never expected, a strange unease settled in his chest. Emily let out a breath, shaking her head. "Look, I get it. You have unfinished business. But just don't forget what you learned here." Richard met her gaze, and for the first time he realized he didn't want to leave. Not really. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. "I will come back." Emily looked at him, searching his face for any sign of a lie. Then she nodded, just once. "You better." And for the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell knew he had something worth coming back for. The day Richard left, the sky was a dull gray, thick clouds rolling over the mountains like a heavy curtain. The air was colder than usual, or maybe it only felt that way to Emily as she stood outside the cabin, watching him prepare to leave. He was dressed in borrowed winter gear, bundled against the elements, but something about him already looked different, like he didn't quite belong here anymore. His injured leg had healed enough for him to travel, though he still moved with a slight limp. The sled dogs, restless and eager, barked in anticipation of the journey ahead. Emily crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral. "You sure you're ready for this, city boy?" Richard smirked, though there was something sad in his eyes. "I don't think I have a choice." She exhaled, her breath forming a small cloud in the freezing air. "I guess not." Martha, standing a few feet away, gave Richard a hard look. "Be careful out there, boy. The world ain't as forgiving as this place." Richard nodded. "I know." He turned back to Emily, hesitating. There were a million things he wanted to say, but none of them felt right. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into her hand. It was a silver compass, worn with age. Emily frowned. "What's this?" "My grandfather's," Richard said. "He used to say it would always point him home." Emily looked up, meeting his gaze. "And where's home for you?" Richard hesitated. Then, softly, he said, "I don't know yet." Emily swallowed hard, curling her fingers around the compass. "You better figure it out." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Richard took a step back and climbed onto the sled. With a sharp command to the dogs, they lurched forward, kicking up a flurry of snow. Emily stood there, unmoving, watching as he disappeared into the white horizon. And for the first time since she was a child, she felt something strange, something that scared her more than any storm. She missed him. The weeks passed slowly. Emily threw herself into work, hunting, chopping wood, fixing what needed fixing. She told herself she didn't care that Richard hadn't sent word. But every morning she found herself glancing toward the trail he had left on. And every night she found herself staring at the small silver compass, turning it over in her fingers as if it held some kind of answer. Martha noticed, of course. "He's not coming back," her grandmother said one evening, stirring a pot of stew over the fire. Emily didn't look up. "I never said he was." Martha sighed, shaking her head. "You like him?" Emily scoffed. "Doesn't matter if I do. He has his world. I have mine." Martha studied her for a long moment. And what if his world isn't what he wants anymore? Emily didn't have an answer for that. Then, one evening, everything changed. Emily was outside stacking firewood when she heard the distant sound of sled dogs approaching. She turned, expecting one of the village traders. But instead, a man she had never seen before stepped off the sled. He was tall, dressed in a heavy coat lined with fur, his face sharp with the air of someone who didn't belong in these parts. The man pulled something from his pocket, a sealed envelope. "Miss Dawson?" he asked. Emily nodded slowly. The man extended the letter. "This is from Richard Caldwell." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She hesitated before taking the envelope, the cold paper stiff in her hands. The man gave a small nod. "He's waiting for you." Emily's breath caught. Richard hadn't forgotten her. And now, for the first time, it was her turn to decide where she belonged. Emily had never seen so many lights in her life. New York City stretched out before her like a living, breathing entity, towering skyscrapers reaching toward the sky, endless streams of people moving like currents through the streets. The honking of horns, the flashing billboards, the sheer energy of the place, it was overwhelming. She tightened her grip on the small silver compass in her pocket, her only tether to the world she had left behind. The black car that had picked her up from the airport wove through the bustling streets until it pulled up in front of a grand hotel. The doorman opened her door, offering a polite nod, but Emily barely noticed. She was too busy staring up at the massive glass structure before her. Was this really where Richard lived? The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, save for the quiet hum of the city below. And then the doors slid open. Richard was waiting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked different, dressed in a tailored suit, clean-shaven, every bit the billionaire he had been before. But his eyes were different. There was something softer there, something she hadn't seen in him when they first met. "Emily," he said, stepping forward. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay steady. "You wrote to me." He exhaled, nodding. "I told you I'd come back. When I realized I couldn't, I had to bring you to me." Emily looked around the penthouse, polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the sheer wealth of it all. It felt like another world, a world she didn't belong to. Richard must have sensed her hesitation because he stepped closer. "I know it's a lot," he admitted, "but I didn't bring you here to impress you." Emily crossed her arms. "Then why did you bring me here?" Richard took a slow breath. "Because I needed you to see the man I used to be, and the man I'm trying to become." Over the next few days, Emily saw firsthand just how much Richard had changed. He had fired Jonathan Reed, pressed charges, and reclaimed control of his company. But more than that, he had started something new, a foundation. The Dawson Initiative, Richard explained one evening over dinner. It's a nonprofit dedicated to helping people in rural communities, especially in places like Alaska. Infrastructure, medical aid, education. Real, lasting change. Emily blinked. "You named it after me?" Richard smiled. "I wouldn't be here without you." She stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was just another business strategy. But all she saw was sincerity. Real, undeniable sincerity. One night, as they walked along the edge of Central Park, Richard finally said what she had been waiting for. "I love you, Emily." Her breath caught. Richard reached for her hands, his grip warm despite the chill in the air. "I don't care about anything else. Not the money, not the company. I just want you." Emily's heart pounded, but she didn't speak right away. Because part of her still didn't trust this world. She had seen men of power before, men who made promises but never truly understood what life outside of their bubble was like. And she wasn't willing to be another piece in someone else's collection. So instead, she said, "If you love me, Richard, then prove it." His brows furrowed. "How?" Emily held up the compass. "Find your way home." Weeks passed. Emily returned to Alaska, unsure if Richard would follow. But he did. Die. Not with private jets or expensive suits, but as a man who wanted to learn. He spent months in the village, working alongside her, understanding the land, the people, the struggles they faced every day. He chopped wood, carried water, even learned how to hunt, though he was still terrible at it. And in that time, Emily saw it. This wasn't just a game to him. He had changed. One evening, as they stood by the river, watching the northern lights dance across the sky, Richard turned to her. "Emily," he said, voice steady. "Can I stay?" She looked at him, the man who had once been lost in a storm, who had been broken and betrayed, who had rebuilt himself not with money, but with something far greater. A man who had found his way home. She smiled, slipping her hand into his. "Yeah," she whispered. "You can stay." And as the lights shimmered above them, Emily knew this was just the beginning. And so Richard found something far more valuable than wealth. He found purpose, love, and a place to truly call home. Emily, the girl who once saved a stranger in the snow, had unknowingly saved a lost soul searching for something he never knew he needed. Together they built a life that bridged two worlds, one of untamed wilderness and one of towering skyscrapers. But in the end, it wasn't the wealth or the power that mattered. It was the simple moments, the quiet love, and the understanding that true riches come not from what we own, but from the people who stand beside us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more heartfelt tales that inspire and uplift. Let us bring you more stories of love, resilience, and the unexpected beauty of human connection. Until next time, stay warm, stay hopeful, and always believe in the kindness of strangers.